Let me describe a situation. You're somewhere in your late 50s or 60s. You've been working hard for a long time. The job is demanding, maybe more demanding than it used to be. You're tired in a way that a vacation doesn't fix anymore. And you start doing the math. You look at your savings, you look at Social Security projections, you look at what your monthly expenses actually are, and you realize the numbers aren't quite there. Not yet. Maybe not for a few more years. So you stay, you keep grinding, you tell yourself you'll figure it out later. Meanwhile, the job gets heavier, your patience gets shorter, the gap between who you are at work and who you actually are keeps widening. Here's what nobody tells you in that moment: full retirement isn't your only option. There's a middle path. And for a lot of people, maybe most people in that exact situation, it's actually the smarter path, not just financially, in every way that matters. Today, we're talking about semi retirement as a deliberate bridge strategy, not a consolation prize, not what you do when you couldn't quite make it. A real designed approach to the transition between full time employment and full time retirement. One that works financially, works psychologically, and works on your terms. I'm Rich Jones. This is Living Without an Expiration Date. Let's get into it. There's a trap of binary thinking. The first problem is we need to address the way most people frame this decision. They treat it as binary. You're either working or you're retired. You're either in or you're out. You're either fully employed or full stop. That framing is almost never accurate. And it's often the thing that keeps people stuck longer than they need to be in their current role. Here's why it happens. The cultural narrative around retirement is binary. You work, you save, you hit a number or an age, and you retire. That's the story. And because it's the dominant story, a lot of people assume it's the only story, but it's not. The workforce has changed dramatically with the gig economy, remote work, consulting platforms, fractional executive roles, part time professional works. These aren't fringe options anymore. They're real, viable, and often well compensated ways to work. And they've created more legitimate pathways into semi retirement than have ever existed before. But here's the more important point: the binary framing doesn't just limit your options, it distorts the problem. When you ask, can I afford to retire? You're asking a yes or no question. The question is often no or not yet, and that closes the conversation. But when you ask, what would it take to sustain my life with significantly less employment income? You're asking a design question, and design questions have a lot more interesting answers. Semi-retirement, when it's treated as a serious strategy rather than a fallback, is a design answer to that question. It's not about working less because you gave up. It's about working differently because you finally got smart. Let's talk about what semi-retirement actually means and what it requires. So first, let's start by defining the territory, because semi-retirement means different things to different people. For our purposes today, semi-retirement is any intentional reduction in full-time employment that generates meaningful income, enough to cover a significant portion of your living expenses while giving you substantially more control over your time, energy, and the nature of the work itself. That could look like a lot of things. It could be leaving a demanding corporate role and consulting in your field at a fraction of the hours. It could be dropping from full time to part time at the same organization or a different one. It could be fractional executive work where you bring your expertise to multiple organizations on a project or retainer basis. It could be portfolio work, a mix of paid engagements, board participation, adjunct teaching, or advisory roles that together add up to a meaningful income without any single one of them consuming you. What these have in common is this: you are still generating income, but you are no longer organized around someone else's full time demands. That distinction matters enormously. Now, what does semi retirement actually require? Well, it requires a clear eyed financial picture. You need to know specifically how much income semi retirement has to generate, not approximately, specifically. That means your actual monthly expenses. What's fixed? What's discretionary? What are you willing to adjust? And what you're not. A lot of people avoid this number because it feels scary. But the number, whatever it is more manageable than the anxiety of not knowing. Get the number. And it requires marketable expertise. Semi-retirement works best when you have something specific and valuable to offer. A domain, a competency, a network, a track record, a particular kind of problem. Most people who have been in a career for 20 or 30 years have more of this than they realize. The challenge isn't having something to offer, it's packaging it, being able to articulate it clearly to people who need it. We'll come back to that. It also requires a different relationship with income. In full-time employment, income is predictable. You get a paycheck, you know what it is. In semi-retirement, income is often variable. Some months are fuller than others. Projects start and end. This variability can be uncomfortable if you're not prepared for it. And it can become a genuine problem if you don't have a financial buffer. Before you make the move, you want some combination of buffer, a clear pipeline, or a part-time arrangement that provides a base, ideally more than one of those. And it also requires honest self-assessment about what kind of work you can actually sustain. Semi-retirement isn't just about working less, it's about working sustainably. And that means being honest about what kind of work energizes you versus drains you. If you spend your semi-retirement years doing work that feels exactly like what you were trying to escape, just with fewer benefits, you haven't solved the problem. You've just created a smaller version of it. The design question isn't just how do I generate income? It's what kind of work can I do at this stage in my life, at this level of engagement without running myself into the ground. But we've got to make the numbers work. Let's spend some time on the financial side because this is where most people's semi-retirement plans either work or fail. I want to be clear about something up front. I'm not a financial advisor. This isn't investment advice. What I am is someone who has worked with a lot of people navigating this exact transition, and there are patterns in what works and what doesn't. So we'll start with the gap. The core financial question in semi-retirement is, what's the gap between what you'll earn in retirement and what you actually need? If your monthly expenses are $6,000 and your semi-retirement income covers $4,000, you have a $2,000 gap. That gap has to come from somewhere. Savings, a pension, a spouse's income, Social Security, investment returns. Understanding that gap precisely is the foundation of everything. What a lot of people discover when they do this math carefully for the first time often is that the gap is smaller than they feared. Not always, but often, because full time employment carries costs that disappear in semi retirement. Work wardrobe, commuting, lunches out, convenience spending driven by exhaustion, sometimes even a mortgage on a house sized for a lifestyle that no longer fits. So I want you to think about income in layers. Sustainable retirement income usually has multiple layers, and no single layer needs to cover everything. Layer number one is your direct work income, consulting fees, part time wages, project payments. This is the variable layer, it fluctuates. Layer two is whatever consistent non work income you already have or can access. If you have a pension, that goes here. If you're in an age where you can access retirement accounts without penalty, the drawdown from those accounts goes here. A rental property income goes here. Layer three is Social Security, which notably most people can access starting at 62, though full benefit calculation rewards are worth waiting for. Understanding where you are in that calculus is worth a real conversation with a financial professional. The point of thinking in layers is that you don't need any layer to be large enough to cover everything. You need the layers together to close the gap. And often, when you map it out, they do, especially if you're willing to make some adjustments. But the big question that is the biggest burden is the healthcare question. I'm going to name this directly because it's the thing that derails more semi-retirement plans than anything else. If you're under 65 and leaving employer-sponsored health insurance, you need a plan. COBRA is expensive and time limited. The ACA marketplace plans vary widely by by income, and coverage level. Maybe your spouse's plan is an option. Some part-time arrangements, particularly in larger organizations, include benefits. Medical insurance is a real constraint. I'm not going to minimize it, but it is solvable. Constraints for most people who approach it deliberately. It is solvable. It is a solvable constraint for most people who approach it deliberately. It requires research, planning, and sometimes some creative arrangement making, but it's not by itself a reason to abandon the plan. Let's talk about the sequence of this retirement account access. One of the most useful tools in the semi-retirement bridge is understanding the sequence in which you can and should access different account types. At 59 and a half, you can access most retirement accounts without early withdrawal penalty. At 62, you can begin collecting Social Security, though at a reduced rate. At 65, Medicare kicks in. At 67 or 70, depending on your birth year, Social Security reaches its maximum benefit. Understanding this sequence and planning your semi-retirement income strategy around it can dramatically change the math. For example, if you're 58 and need to reduce your income significantly, you may need to draw more heavily on savings for 18 months until penalty-free retirement account access opens up. That's a finite, plannable challenge, not an open-ended one. None of this replaces a real conversation with a financial planner who knows your specific situation. But knowing the structure helps you ask the right questions. So, what do you actually do? Okay, once you've established that the numbers can work, at least in principle, now the question is, what does the work actually look like? This is where I want to get practical because I think a lot of people get stuck in that in at the aspiration level. I'll consult, I'll do some part-time work without ever getting specific enough to actually make it happen. Start with what you know. The most reliable foundation for semi retirement work is deep expertise in a domain you already spent years developing. You're not starting from scratch, you're repackaging something you already have. Ask yourself, what do people come to me for? What problems have I solved repeatedly over the course of my career? What would an organization in my industry pay to have access to? Not full time, but for a specific project, a specific challenge, a specific moment of transition. That intersection, your expertise, their need, a defined scope is the basis for consulting and fractional work. Get specific about your offer. Vague consulting doesn't pay well. I'm available to consult on organizational effectiveness is a much harder sell than I work with credit unions under $250 million in assets to develop differentiation strategies that don't depend on merger activity. The more specific you can describe what you do, who it's for, and what it produces, the easier it is for the right people to say yes. This feels uncomfortable to a lot of people who spent their careers inside organizations where their role was defined for them. Defining your own offer in your own language for your market is a different skill, but it's learnable and it gets easier to do once you do it. Then think about the engagement model. Semi-retirement work can be structured in a variety of ways, and the structure you choose matters for both your income stability and your quality of life. Project-based work is discrete. You have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's clean and finite, but your income is episodic. When projects end, so does the income from them. Retainer arrangements are more sustainable and more stable. You're not on a, you're on an ongoing basis with one or more clients for a defined number of hours or deliverables per month. The income is more predictable. The trade-off is some obligation to be consistently available. Part-time employment, actually taking a part-time job with an organization, provides the most structure and predictability and sometimes benefits. The trade-off is less control over your time and typically more institutional obligation than pure consulting. Portfolio work is a mix of all of the above. It provides variety and redundancy. If one engagement ends, you're not starting from zero. This is often the most sustainable model for people who want genuine autonomy, but it takes more active management. None of these is universally right. The right model depends on your financial floor, your appetite for variability, and what you actually find engaging. So you need to make a psychological contract with yourself. Here's something that doesn't get discussed enough in the practical planning sessions. When you move from employment to semi-retirement consulting or fractional work, you are now responsible for your own motivation, your own direction, and your own accountability. No one is managing you. Nobody is giving you an annual review. Nobody is keeping track of your outputs. That's the freedom, and it's real. But it also means you need to be your own structure. And a lot of people, particularly people who've thrived in high accountability organizational environments, find this harder than they expected. The semi retirement period is a good time to build those self management muscles, to develop the practices, routines, rhythms, ways of tracking your own progress that will serve you even more in full retirement. So, how do I know when I'm ready to cross? Let's talk about the bridge metaphor directly, because I think it's the right frame for this conversation. Semi-retirement in this context is not a destination, it's a bridge. You're building towards something, full retirement, eventually on your own terms. The semi-retirement period is a span that gets you there without blowing up your finances or your sense of self in the process. So, how do you know when the bridge has done its job? How do you know when you're ready to cross to the other side? There are a few markers worth watching. Financial readiness is a different look at this context. The conventional retirement planning number, the you need 25 times your annual expenses saved rule of thumb, is based on full retirement from the day you stop working. If you've been semi retired for 5 or 7 years, generating meaningful income along the way and delaying Social Security, your actual required portfolio can be substantially different. This is one of the most underappreciated benefits of a semi retirement bridge. Every year you generate income in semi retirement is a year you're not drawing down your savings. It's a year your investments continue to compound. It's potentially a year you've increased your eventual Social Security benefit by waiting to claim. The math is genuinely different, and it's usually better than people expect when they actually run it out. Identity readiness is its own signal. Semi retirement, when it works, gradually loosens your grip on professional identity. Not all at once, but gradually. You start to notice that your sense of self isn't entirely tied up in what you're working on. You start to build a life that has meaning and texture outside of your professional role. The consulting work becomes something you do rather than the primary thing you are. When that shift happens, when you can genuinely imagine a full retirement that feels full rather than empty, that's a signal worth paying attention to. Your energy also tells you things your plan doesn't. Pay attention to how you feel about the work as the semi retirement period progresses. If you're genuinely engaged and energized by it, if you're taking on new engagements because you want to, not just because you need the income, that is useful information. And it might mean you want to continue longer than you originally planned. If the work starts to feel like obligation again, if you're doing it primarily to hit a number rather than because it still engages you, the balance has shifted from I choose to work to I have to work. That's also useful information. It might mean the bridge is ready to end. There's no universal answer here. Some people semi retire for 3 years and are ready to be fully done. Others do it for 10 and generally don't want to stop. Both are valid. The point is to stay conscious about it, to revisit the question regularly rather than defaulting to inertia in either direction. And there is a trap of one more year. I want to name this directly because it's real and it catches a lot of people. The one more year syndrome. When you keep extending the timeline because the number is quite there, or you're not quite sure, or something feels unresolved, can extend the bridge indefinitely. Some of that is prudent. Some of it is fear dressed up as financial planning. The only way to tell the difference is to be honest with yourself about which one is driving the decision. Is the extension driven by a genuine financial need that you can quantify and address? Or is it driven by anxiety about what the other side looks like? Both deserve attention, but they require different responses. Here's what I want to leave you with. If you're in that place, tired, not quite financially ready, telling yourself you have to keep grinding until the number is there, I want you to hear this clearly. You have more options than you think. The path from where you are to sustainable, meaningful retirement doesn't have to go straight through 5 more years of full employment at full-time pace. There is a middle path, and for a lot of people, it's a better path, not just financially, but in every way that matters. Semi-retirement, when it's designed intentionally, buys you something money can't directly purchase: time. Time to figure out who you are outside of your title. Time to build the life you actually want to retire into. Time to let the financial picture improve without running yourself into the ground in the process. It's not a compromise, it's a strategy. The people who navigate this transition best are the ones who stop asking, can I afford to retire? And start asking, how do I design the next 10 years so that I can land exactly where I want to be? That's a bigger question. It's a harder question, but it's the right question. And it's one you're capable of answering. I'm Rich Jones. This is Live Without an Expiration Date. If this episode landed for you, if it describes something you've been feeling but couldn't quite articulate, share it with somebody who needs to hear it. These conversations don't happen enough, and the people who need them most are the ones most often least likely to go looking for them. Help them out. We'll be back soon. Do your work.